to Dr. Bestebreurtje.
Great, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much. So as has been mentioned, my name is Lindsay Bestebreurtje. I'm a historian of African-American community development and the built environment in the 19th and 20th century American South. I hold a PhD in history and a master's in museum studies. For the last decade, I have worked in various public history sites, including the Historic American Building Survey, the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, and the National Park Service. But since 2015, I have worked as a curatorial assistant at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'd like to thank our hosts for inviting me to speak with you all tonight. So my presentation explores segregation and racialized zoning and planning laws in Arlington to see the ways in which these policies impacted the county's suburban growth from the 1900s to the mid 20th century. We're going to open at the turn of the last century when Arlington's suburban boom first began, laying out the race-based policies of early boosters, and continue into discussions of restrictive covenants, planning laws, and how Arlington's communities, both Black and white, grew together and in opposition. The majority of this research comes from my dissertation, which is entitled Built by the People Themselves, African American Community Development in Arlington County, Virginia, from Civil War to Civil Rights. So if we can go to our first slide. So first, just a brief rundown of Arlington's history. I'm sure most of you have the broad strokes, but it's a 25.7 square mile land. This land did not become a distinct entity until 1790, when Virginia donated Arlington County and Alexandria City to form a portion of Washington, D.C. But then in 1846, the district retroceded Virginia's lands back to the Old Dominion. And in 1870, the county officially split from the city before changing its name from Alexandria County to Arlington County in 1920. So even though it has the name change during the time period that I'm discussing with you all tonight, I'm going to call it Arlington throughout just for the sake of clarity. So next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. At the onset of the 20th century, Arlington underwent a suburban boom spurred by the lure of federal jobs and railway expansion. From 1900 to 1910, the county's population grew from 6,400 to 10,000. During that same decade, 70 new neighborhoods and communities developed in Arlington. These communities battled for physical space in what we know is a very small county. This competition for space also included divisions over competing aesthetics and ideas about what constituted desirable homes and neighborhoods. The types of homes and communities created were tied to class. Working class neighborhoods had simple, small, clapboard homes, which were often constructed by the homeowners themselves. This was the case in the working class Halls Hill and Queen City communities. The aesthetics and choices of middle class communities were tied to future aspirations for both themselves and their children. Communities like the middle class Lyon Park had the aesthetics of a traditional streetcar suburb with the pre-platted lands and more standardized single family homes that were often built by a developer all at once. All of these communities and community types shaped Arlington's early suburban development. So slide. Arlington's neighborhoods were diverse in class makeup as well as race. Arlington had Black and white neighborhoods and enclaves dotted around the county. Black neighborhoods included the previously mentioned Queen City and Halls Hill, as well as the middle class neighborhoods of Johnson's Hill, Green Valley, and Butler Homes. As Arlington boomed, enterprising developers realized that in order to control the aesthetics, class and race makeup, and the wealth at stake in these communities, they would need to create a system of county-wide control. So Arlington's boosters and developers increasingly turned their attention to state and county politics. So going from beyond the individual neighborhoods to a broader form of power control. Next slide. So two of the primary developers and leaders at this time were Frank Lyon and Crandall Mackey. These two men had similar social and political opinions, and in 1890, they established the Good Citizens League. The League was a social and political group comprised of about 20 of the county's wealthiest and most prominent men. Many League aims centered on bringing more municipal improvements to the county. They pushed for a centralized public water supply and sewer system. Arlington also undertook significant road paving campaigns, sidewalk and curb construction, and additions of street lamps and telephone lines. Though these reforms addressed legitimate municipal needs, League members sought this suburban infrastructure specifically so that they could control the path of that development. According to League member Frank Ball, whose family founded Ballston, quote, "Those interested in developing real estate in the county helmed the League. They saw their organization as a life or death struggle, without which Arlington would never have grown into a fine residential community," end quote. So these municipal improvements were easily secured by white neighborhoods, but white Arlington officials cared little about the lack of amenities in the Black parts of town. When speaking about the county's water and sewage system, county officials announced that they had made significant improvements in every, quote, "neighborhood where there are a number of respectable white people residing," end quote. No such assurances were made for Black neighborhoods, and after a decade of improvements, Arlington's Black neighborhoods did not have paved streets. Green Valley, Queen City, and Halls Hill had unfinished road and unsurfaced streets into the 1940s, and in some cases beyond. So Arlington's early boosters and developers supported residential segregation. League members who were developers all created racially segregated communities. Mackey with Maywood, Lyon with Lyon Park and Lyon Village, William Ball with Ballston, and they also had some members who were builders, and the homes that they built were within segregated communities. So to shape public opinion in accordance with the League's focus on white, middle-class suburban development, Frank Lyon purchased the weekly newspaper, The Monitor. Under Lyon's leadership as owner and editor, The Monitor pushed League policies and opinions, including calls for a new state constitution to limit the voting rights of Black citizens and their political opposition. In this environment, Virginia created a new constitution in 1902, which disenfranchised nearly all Black voters across the state. Lyon and Mackey both served at that constitutional convention. So testing the impact of the new voting laws, the League fielded their own candidate for the first time in 1903, nominating Crandall Mackey for Commonwealth's attorney. Mackey faced pretty stiff opposition from the incumbent Richard Johnston, and the contest was a dead heat. In the end, Mackey won by only 2 votes. According to newspaper accounts of the time, quote, "The reduction of the Negro vote under the new Virginia Constitution helped Mackey wonderfully," end quote. Despite charges of corruption due to the extremely small margin of victory, Mackey and the League chose to use this election as a mandate. Next slide. But new voting laws were just one piece of the equation. In order to have more complete control of the county and its development, League members sought to remove African Americans and other individuals who they deemed to be less desirable from the lands that they wanted for themselves. The links between race and League policies about development and reform can be seen in the League's dramatic and violent cleanup of Roslyn. Despite the portrayal of this event being quite cartoonish, it was a serious matter. So beginning in the 1870s, Roslyn's location immediately across the Aqueduct Bridge from Washington and just about a mile from Fort Myer made it a hot spot for gambling and saloons. But Roslyn was also home to a small African-American enclave, a community. Rather than seeing a small working class Black community, which is how Roslyn's Black residents would likely define themselves, League members characterized the enclave as, quote, a gathering of shacks that were inhabited by the riffraff of the county. So while temperance and fears about political corruption from gambling interests were legitimate concerns for many League members, their obsession with respectability and lawlessness were not in any way colorblind. Many also complained that these saloons and gambling houses were not segregated spaces. On Sunday, May 30th, 1904, Mackey and members of the Good Citizens League armed themselves and set out to clean up Roslyn once and for all. A posse of 6 embarked on the raid, Mackey, Lyon, and 4 other League members. Rather than using the county sheriff or police force, Mackey chose to deputize these men and handed out several sacks of weapons, including sledgehammers, axes, and a sawed-off shotgun. This group of vigilantes attacked 2 saloons in Arlington, throwing people through closed windows, arresting patrons and employees, and destroying property as weapons were used to hack up bars, break slot machines, and destroy alcohol. The scene was chaotic and violent, but the event only saw 1 shot fired. A League member fired his gun at the back of a fleeing Black man who luckily was not struck. And with the reclamation of Roslyn, commercial and real estate development proceeded almost immediately. Go to the next slide. So this is the background for the county's early suburban developers and boosters. The physical growth of nearly 100 white communities in the first 3 decades of the 20th century meant that new neighborhoods encroached on existing Black communities. That was the case in Queen City. Since 1910, the Arlington-based Barbara Williams and Company Real Estate and Insurance Group subdivided lots for the White Highland Park neighborhood. Developers realized that the land around Queen City, which was, in their words, 3.5 miles from and 450 feet higher than Washington City, situated on both steam and electric roads, created an ideal location for a beautiful suburban subdivision, end quote. Arlington's Black communities existed in desirable areas, which is a unique feature for Black communities and neighborhoods around the country at this time. But this location meant that, according to Highland Park's advertisements, these Black families had access to views and cool air, which they said make life worth living. But it also meant that white land developers sought out these same areas, putting Arlington's African-American communities at particular risk of white encroachment. Beyond encroaching physically on the lands previously designated as African-American, these communities also established housing types distinct from Black Arlington. So the distinct aesthetic choices between the Black and white residents established racial inconsistencies visible across neighborhoods. And these conflicting visions of preferred suburban environments provided white leaders with an allegedly non-racial grounds to attack the Black suburban communities as undesirable. In Arlington's African-American communities, homes were predominantly constructed by individual builders. This resulted in more diversity in type and a slower development for a community generally. But in Arlington's new and expanding white communities, entire neighborhoods were subdivided and homes were built at once. Frank Lyon's developments, for example, went beyond just a centralized community design to create a streamlined environment with homogeneous houses. Ready-cut houses provided residents with a few choices of styles to be built by a professional builder with relationships to Lion. So many Lion Park homes were constructed as somewhat modest wood frame Queen Anne or bungalow homes, which are very similar to what you would have seen at the time in the African American neighborhoods of Butler Homes and Green Valley. But later builders used suburbanized iterations of the Craftsman, Colonial Revival, and Tudor styles. Similarly, the homes developed in Lion Village were professionally built. They were single family, large brick homes, restricted to the classic colonial, mission, or Tudor revival styles. And this standardization was not unique in Lion subdivision. In Highland Park, for example, the Barbara Williams Company not only subdivided the lands for the entire neighborhood at once, but they also constructed all the homes for their buyers. Arlington's subdivisions were becoming increasingly standardized at this time, and this standardization existed within subdivision borders with uniform lots, layouts, and home choices, and across communities, creating an increasingly uniform environment across Arlington's new neighborhoods. This similarity was true across communities because many were constructed and designed by the same developers and builders. For example, Burton E. Church, a pharmacist by trade, developed homes in Clarendon, Ballston, and Falls Church. Go to the next slide. So nearly all of these new communities contained restrictive covenants. A covenant is a legally enforceable contract imposed in a deed upon the buyer of a property. Owners who violate the terms of the covenant risk forfeiting the property. Most covenants run with the land and are legally enforceable on future buyers of the property. Racially restrictive covenants refer to contractual agreements that prohibit the purchase, lease, or occupation of a piece of property by a particular group of people, usually African Americans. Racially restrictive covenants were not only mutual agreements between property owners in a neighborhood not to sell to certain people, but were also agreements enforced through the cooperation of real estate boards and neighborhood associations. Racially restrictive covenants were common practice beginning in the 1910s and became much more widespread following a 1926 US Supreme Court decision, Corrigan v. Buckley, which validated their use. Lion Park's restrictive covenant stated, quote, "Neither said property nor any part thereof nor any interest therein shall be sold or leased to anyone not of the Caucasian race," end quote. Alcova Heights covenant stated that, quote, "No portion of said land shall be sold or leased to anyone of African descent," end quote. And in Barcroft, the school and civic lead were limited to residents, quote, "who are members of the Caucasian race." This racial makeup was actually a big selling point for Arlington's white neighborhoods. A Clarendon advertisement highlighted not only the community's access to transportation, views, and great homes, but they also stated that there was, quote, "not a colored residence within the borders," end quote. And Lion Village advertisements ensured potential buyers that the beautiful suburban community was, quote, "destined to become a community of particular people as it was reserved for the white race alone." Next slide. So restrictive racial covenants joined other laws and regulations designed to limit Black buyers in communities in Arlington. In 1914, Arlington created the Suburban Control Ordinance, the first county-wide planning law. All new neighborhoods must be approved by the county engineer. As a direct result of this law, Arlington was able to create racially segregated neighborhoods. The law also legislated against older homes and prevented individuals from doing their own construction, instead requiring use of a professional contractor. These provisions disproportionately affected Arlington's Black communities. Regulations which previously only applied to individual subdivisions were now used to regulate the county as a whole. Recall that Arlington's amenities did not stretch into Black communities. So these standards threatened to condemn Black neighborhoods who did not have access to the improvements the county now demanded. The legislation was supported and approved by the County Board of Supervisors with the influence of county politicians Mackey, Ball, and other builders and real estate interests. Housing choices for African Americans in Arlington were significantly limited by these new laws, where many new Black communities were created throughout the last decades of the 19th century. From the 1910s onwards, racialized restrictions and segregation laws established by Arlington's white leaders meant that new expansion was not open to African Americans. Instead, the existing communities became much more densely populated. For example, the Johnson's Hill community began in 1880 with just 4 plots, but by 1913, that same land contained 70 plots and homes. Green Valley saw a huge surge in population and subdivision. The neighborhood grew by 70 families during the years of World War I alone. Residents subdivided lots and created multi-family housing via duplexes, row homes, and apartments in Arlington's Black areas, including Green Valley and Roslyn. Many whites saw these changes as threatening to the kind of ideal single-family suburb that they envisioned. Quote, all sections of Arlington County are threatened by row houses, warned a flyer generated by the Lion Park Civic Association. The people of the Federation felt that row homes would threaten the segregated middle-class suburban ideal that they sought. So next slide. Without regard to whether Black Arlington's neighborhoods challenged or reinforced their own aesthetic visions, Arlington's white leaders steadily created zoning, planning, and covenant legislation in an attempt to push out the large and diverse communities established throughout the county. This resistance was the case no matter what kind of community was created, from the working class Queen City to the middle class Butler homes. This opposition to all Black neighborhoods, despite their class or aesthetic, highlights how zoning and planning laws that on one level create a specific suburban vision for the county were also deeply tied to racial segregation. While grounded in language of aesthetics, of home design and neighborhood layout, the true cornerstone of white suburban desires at this time was Black absence. In 1948, Shelley v. Kramer, the Supreme Court ruled that racial covenants were unenforceable. However, they remained commonplace. They were used to steer Black residents away from white neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual recommended the use of restrictive covenants as they, quote, provide the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use, end quote. The FHA's segregationist policies became known as redlining because they showed Black neighborhoods in red on official loan maps, and that status meant that those individuals living within that neighborhood were very unlikely to receive an FHA housing loan. It became illegal. Go to the next slide. So beginning in the 1930s and continuing through the 1950s, federal expansion during the New Deal, World War II, and continuing into the early years of the Cold War created a huge number of new federal jobs. Newly arrived federal workers from around the country chose to settle in Arlington in record numbers. Arlington had a population of 26,000 in 1930, 57,000 in 1940, 135,000 in 1950, and 162,000 by 1960. Suburban development throughout the county exploded in response to this rise in population and corresponding demand. These people in the built environments they created, in some ways, were a continuation of the suburban trajectory Arlington's leaders worked hard to establish at the turn of the century. However, in other really significant ways, this was a departure from the vision of developers, planners, and politicians like Mackey, Lyon, and the League. To accommodate such a huge influx of population, these neighborhoods increasingly used higher density duplex, garden apartment, and apartment developments, such as Fairlington, which was built at this time. These building types joined Arlington's almost exclusively single-family neighborhoods. This marked a change in Arlington's built environment that many existing leaders and residents did not plan for or agree with. The new arrival of war workers from around the country also led to a social shakeup in Arlington. New arrivals from beyond the South created a social and political climate in Arlington that was far more progressive. Though far from perfect, these new arrivals ushered in an era of increased spending, school desegregation, and the preservation of Arlington's neighborhoods, both Black and white, through the Neighborhood Conservation Program, which allowed those neighborhoods that had survived to this point to remain intact largely until this day. So just with the final slide, I just want to say, I hope that this discussion of Arlington's early development has been illuminating to the ways in which allegedly colorblind zoning and planning laws were actually explicitly designed to hinder Black residents. Understanding the intentions behind and ramifications of laws and social systems helps to shed light on how those institutions are still used to promote inequality today. And I hope that this historical understanding can also encourage people to thoughtfully investigate some of the coded language, or at very least secondary consequences of these types of policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bestebreurtje. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, who has been monitoring the chat line to see if there's any questions that she would like to pose. So if Jessica, if you want to unmute.
Actually, this is Annette, and
Okay.
I've been taking, watching carefully the chat room, but I have a couple other questions while people are posing their questions into that. And one is, Dr. Bestebreurtje, Richard Johnson, who lost to Mackey during that election you described, what were his views on this, and why did he lose?
Well, he lost because of the change in the Constitution. Okay. There were charges of the time of corruption. The change in the political makeup as a result of the 1902 Constitution had sweeping impacts in Arlington. It had sweeping impacts across the country, across the state. And at this same time, similar constitutional conventions happened throughout the South, throughout the country. So this is one example of a trend of that time. With regards to how Johnson himself, where he stood on the issue, he had sold the land that became Johnson's Hill, which is now Arlington View. So he had sold his land to African-American families. I don't know much about his individual politics with regards to whether or not he sold that land grudgingly as a result of financial issues, or whether or not he just didn't care who bought it as long as somebody bought it, or whether or not he had a more egalitarian view of society writ large. But his general policies were better than those that came after.
Okay, all right, thank you. A question from the chat room. Were there any areas that remained racially mixed during segregation?
So yes, with an asterisk. So while this wasn't the case as much in Arlington, you would always see small African American enclaves near wealthy white subdivisions. And these individuals were basically the various domestic help. That wasn't extremely the case in Arlington, but you would see that elsewhere, which was another component of the covenants. It had a stipulation saying that African Americans could live on a property if they were servants. So that goes to show you it's kind of not really the race of it all, but more the place of the person.
Huh.
Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, I mean, you would see this kind of minor mingling, but by the 1940s, definitely, Black communities had been restricted to just the 3 anchor communities of Johnson's Hill, Halls Hill, and Green Valley.
Huh. Okay. We have a question here from the chat room regarding Halls Hill. I know you've done a lot of research on Halls Hill. Can you give us a flavor for how some of these things were specific to Halls Hill?
About what happened specifically there?
About these covenants and the segregation between Halls Hill and surrounding neighborhoods, things like that.
Yeah. So Halls Hill is an interesting case because so it developed in 1866. It came about immediately post-war, and the seller of that land, Basil Hall, had just terrible money troubles, and his was an example of a rather begrudging sale. He was very much on the record about his dislike for African Americans and his support of the Confederacy, that kind of thing. So his willingness to sell his land to African American individuals and families post-war really did just come from a extreme need for cash. So then moving through there, from that kind of start, Halls Hill also became a very interesting study because it was the only African American community to survive that was in North Arlington, with Route 50 as the dividing line. The other minority communities were in South Arlington, but Halls Hill was the only community that was able to remain intact in North Arlington. The reasoning behind why some communities made it and why others were lost is a kind of a combination of social institutions. They have multiple churches relocated there from Freedmen's Village after Freedmen's Village was closed. They had community institutions within the neighborhood. There was a strong sense of connection. They had a school very early on, before many of the white communities in the area did. It was just like an investment and an infrastructure. Now, some of the communities that were lost had those as well. So it's that combination of luck and community building that was able to keep Halls Hill as intact as it has been.
Huh. We have a question. Thank you. That was eye-opening. We have a question that asks for a little bit more information about a concept you mentioned, which is the Neighborhood Preservation Project or Committee. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So in the mid 1960s, historic preservation really became a thing around the country. With a decline in inner cities, as well as the vast expansion of America's highway systems, historic homes, historic neighborhoods around the country were demolished. And this made historic preservation just much more popular. So with that background, Arlington created the Neighborhood Preservation policy that, in the hopes of keeping some of the county's unique neighborhood feel in place during the construction of 66, during the expansion of 395, during the creation of the Metro, said that if you could show how your neighborhood is historic, its long roots in the area, if you were able to show key projects that needed funding in order to preserve your neighborhood, so that it wouldn't be lost to the metro, so that it wouldn't be lost to developers. And if you had, I believe it was definitely over 75%, but it might have even been higher than that, 75% community neighborhood participation that you could apply would help you do improvements. Arlington's African-American communities, the three that remained at that time, Halls Hill, Johnson's Hill, and Green Valley, were in an excellent place to make that play, where a lot of Arlington's neighborhoods had been built in the 1940s. They had roots in the 1800s. They were able to show how the neighborhood improvements, the sidewalk work, the road work, the street lights were very much needed, but had not been brought into their communities. And because they were active neighborhoods that had a lot of community institutions that were tight-knit almost by default because of the lack of anywhere else to go and the common practice of generations staying there, which throughout a lot of Arlington was not and is not the case. It's a little bit more transient than that. They were able to make a bid for these funds, and it happened at a time when the county's population had changed. It had become more progressive, and so they were able to secure those, the designation of as historic, as well as funds. But I do want to mention that of all of the communities, which a majority of Arlington's communities from the 1960s to today have at various points applied through this program and received funds, the only communities that, as a part of receiving funds for this, had their names changed were Arlington's 3 Black communities. Johnson's Hill became Arlington View, Halls Hill became Highview Park, Green Valley became Knock. So to me, it's not a coincidence that only 3 had their names changed, and they would just happen to be the 3 Black communities. So I think that, while I do think that Arlington's movement away from sort of the older, more traditionally Southern policies should definitely be applauded, we shouldn't think it was like a light that suddenly turned on.
Right, we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much.
Yeah, I mean, like a little bit, but not, yeah.
Fair enough. We have a couple questions about apartment living. And one of them is some of the apartment developments from the 1930s. We're wondering how they were segregated. Were there restrictive covenants for the renters, and how did apartment segregation work?
Yeah, so apartment segregation. So when those communities were built in the 1930s and 1940s, they would be built just as like all white developments. It was not one for one, but there also were similar all black developments created at that time. Many of them were put up, the ones that were put up for war workers popped up really quick. Technically didn't follow Arlington's codes, and then were torn down fairly quickly after. But yeah, they just were segregated. You just couldn't apply there if you were a non-white resident. And if you did choose to apply for a spot, you would be told that there weren't any, or that they didn't have one for you, or that your application just wasn't selected. And I mean, it was very common through the 70s.
Oh. So basically they built white apartment buildings and they built black apartment buildings, and the black apartment buildings might be of lesser quality and more like World War II quick housing. And those were the first to come down. So where did Black people go from those apartments, from those World War II buildings?
Well, so as an example, a lot of people have heard in the area about Queen City, which was an African-American community created just outside of Arlington National Cemetery. After the closing of Freedmen's Village, many of the residents went there. It was demolished, not for the Pentagon, but for the Pentagon's road networks. So the building was completely finished with a community just nearby that then with very little notice were told that they were losing their homes to eminent domain. They were given only a few weeks notice, and were given only cursory payments if they were owners, and were given nothing if they were renters. And were forced to move. And those people, after a protest, were given trailer homes that were put up in Green Valley. But that was one, just like, the old metal like tube.
Yeah, like some type.
What they're like, Airstreams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
of those per family. So if you were a family of one, or if you were a family of six, that's what you were given. Some of those people were eventually absorbed into Arlington's existing Black communities, in the same way that lots continued to be subdivided and made smaller. Or living with relatives, but many just left.
Right.
Which, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah. So it wasn't like when they decided to tear something down or move something for roads or whatever, it's not like they gave the Black families much consideration. They just, we need it and you have to go.
Right.
Yeah. So we have a question about one of the maps that you showed earlier on about Glen Carlin.
Mm-hmm.
Is there evidence of covenants or redlining in this neighborhood?
I don't know if I have a specific Glencarlin covenant example. I can't recall, but yeah, they were all segregated, at least in the early 1900s.
So there really weren't any exceptions.
I mean, I'm not going to say there weren't any, because that's not accurate. Also, if you go to the slide underneath the Glencarlin map, which is county growth, is what it's like labeled. It's slide 4. Oh, wait, sorry. Slide 4 in my presentation, but I guess it's not in yours. It shows the different dot
Next one
the
up.
African American neighborhoods that are kind of dotted around
Oh, right, yeah.
the county. So that does help to show how there were African American enclaves, which are like smaller communities that don't have as much infrastructure or community institutions. Those are dotted throughout the county. Now I feel bad that I don't know.
Yeah, I think the closest one there is Boston.
Which slide it is. Can you go? I think I have you on the wrong slide for the individuals who are, it's the,
One more up.
there we go. Yeah. So that shows kind of some of how there were smaller communities kind of dotted around the area. So I don't want to make it seem that just in the same way that segregation didn't one day just stop, it didn't one day just start. So it was a process, but yeah, the growing new neighborhoods were created as whites only spaces.
Okay. And we have a question about when you've alluded to this already, that you said it wasn't like they stopped immediately or stopped on a dime, but when generally can we feel comfortable saying that restrictive covenants in deeds were not permitted anymore? And you mentioned a couple court cases.
Yeah. So they were deemed unenforceable by the Supreme Court in 48. Their use continued until 68 with the Fair Housing Act and changes in those policies. After that, unfortunately, realtor steering of people towards different neighborhoods was still a practice, as well as the continued impact of the FHA's loan policies, because a vast majority of families and individuals in the post-World War II years of the suburban boom got their loans through the cheap government-sponsored FHA loans. And because the African American communities were redlined, were deemed red, which was like risky developments. They were green, yellow, and red. They weren't eligible for those. So they became unenforceable in 48. They became illegal in 68. Mm-hmm. And then from there, it kind of was like a dwindle thing. They also are still technically on most people's houses, and they're unenforceable now, so you wouldn't know.
Wow, really? Huh. I have a question about the Good Citizens League and its possible relationship with the KKK. You showed a picture of the KKK? How?
Oh yeah, so that picture from the KKK was that is
there it is.
Klan members are marching in a funeral parade in the Bon Air neighborhood. That's March 18th, 1922.
Wow.
And yeah, that image comes from the Library of Congress. So I don't have any, I'm not here to say that any of the League members were in the Klan or weren't in the Klan. It's a rather private institution. But I think that that also does help to show what the realities of Arlington were like at the time. And I think that similarly, the fact that the American Nazi Party was founded in Arlington,
Right.
Virginia, is also, you know, it's just something to keep in mind.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We have one more question from someone who is wondering about whether or not you've studied zoning patterns in African American communities and their density patterns related to white neighborhoods. What can you say about that?
So I can say that a lot of times in the African American and minority communities, you will see areas that are zoned for light industrial use. You will see things that are like less harmonious. You will tend to see a more densely populated area that has a harder time getting recreational space, for example. But it's probably in my dissertation, but I could not name for you right now any kind of zoning specifics that would necessarily answer your question if you were looking for any kind of specifics, but I would say that if you have something specific in mind, that you can feel free to email me and I can look that up a little bit more. In my head just now, I was like, I don't know.
Really asked about all the neighborhoods in Arlington today,
Yeah.
that's for sure. Well, that's all the questions we have in the chat room. Kathy, over to you.
Okay, I'm coming back. Hold on. Getting my. All right, so we have all given out all our questions, but we might have some additional questions. So I encourage you at this point, if you have anything additional that you'd like to add or say, you are welcome to unmute and ask your question directly to Lindsay. And I did see one coming from the, looked like one came in the chat. So help yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, Brandon Hemmel, if you'd like to ask your question, go right ahead.
Lindsay, besides racial segregation, have you looked into religious segregation in Arlington? Arlington has many types of churches, but not many other houses of worship, while Montgomery County, Maryland has many Jewish houses of worship.
Yes, so even though the religious component of it is not the primary focus of my work, many of the covenants didn't also included references to Jewish and Armenian and a few other minority groups at the time that were also persona non grata. It was somewhat common after World War II for the covenants to have been edited to remove references to Jewish people not being welcome to buy, but to keep all the other groups. So I guess they decided that that was a bridge too far at that point. But yes, in Arlington's Jewish community in the 50s was also particularly active in Arlington's civil rights battles, as I know that they were in many other places around the country. But the reference to Montgomery County is an interesting one in that they were a much more successful county with regards to diversity and representation purposefully. And so a lot of people who left Arlington would go places like that where they would feel a little bit more welcomed.
I think David Ansel had a question. David, are you on?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was curious as to why you selected development in Arlington as the subject for your dissertation.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So it had a couple of different reasons. I liked that Arlington and Northern Virginia are very much kind of on the border between North and South. So in that case, it wouldn't necessarily be as extreme as if, you know, you studied a Lowndes County, Alabama, for example. I wanted the to be able to take a look at the subtlety, partly because I think that when things are a little bit more veiled or less extreme, it can make you have more reflection. So I like that it was, you know, on the border of North and South. I really, Arlington has a very long suburban history, even though lots of people kind of think of it as like starting in the 40s. It had suburban neighborhoods with streetcar suburbs, with, you know, smaller individual neighborhood developments before it got to the full suburban sprawl. So I liked that it had all of the stages. The federal government also offered a really interesting impact in Arlington because, you know, obviously everywhere in the country is influenced by federal policy changes like the FHA. However, in Arlington, 18% of the physical county is owned and operated by the federal government. So that's like a physical presence. Additionally, federal reforms meant that those jobs were, that federal jobs were based on, you know, mandated standards for hiring, mandated standards for dismissal, a very clear pay scale. And even though it wasn't always applied as equitably as it could have been or should have been, this provided a really great opportunity for Arlington's Black residents to have stable blue collar and white collar employment decades before that could be said throughout the country.
Yeah, thank you.
Plus, I live here.
Yeah.
Any additional questions?
Could you talk a little bit about the population of the population change of the African American community during this period? Was there an out-migration overall growth? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there was some out-migration, but what largely happened was Arlington's Black community kind of stayed the same size. It was very much made up of the individuals who were here pre-Civil War somewhat, but mostly it was people who came to the county because of Freedmen's Village, which was a unique and exceptional contraband camp for self-freeing enslaved individuals during the Civil War. So that led to many people fleeing their situations and heading to Freedmen's Village, where they had homes and education and the opportunity for training. A lot of it was paternalistic, but it offered this huge opportunity. So a lot of Arlington's African-American residents could trace their lineage that far back in this time period that I'm looking at. So it was a lot of core families staying. But what ended up happening is basically Arlington's Black population stayed about the same size while the white population skyrocketed. So, you know, there was that list of numbers when I went from like 1930 to 1960, where it's just like 50,000, 150,000. It's like every 10 years, it was just like growing. And so you had a fairly small, fairly consistent African-American population that went from like 40% of the population in the 19th century to like 3% by the 1970s, 1980s. And then at that point, it also starts to become much more multicultural. So, yeah.
So can you hear me? Can I ask a question? Again, you know, Colonial Village, Fairlington, Arlington Village. Arlington has a lot of these large, quote unquote, historic garden style areas. And I want to confirm what you alluded to, that these were not open to be leased by African Americans at their inceptions in the 30s and 40s. Is that your understanding, that they were essentially non-Black? I don't want to say white only, because I don't know, maybe they let Jewish people in, but that they didn't lease to African Americans?
Yes. So Fairlington is slightly unique in that it was specifically for military staff. So when the Pentagon was built, they had all of these military officers and employees coming to Arlington, and usually when that happens, you would live on a base, but the Pentagon didn't have a base. So the Arlington, the Army Corps of Engineers rather, created Fairlington as a really kind of model community, showing like all the different things, all the amenities that they would provide and the things that they would do. So that at its onset was very much more like a military base, but it was just for officers. So it is improbable that there were minority officers in the early 1940s who were brought to the Pentagon. I'm not a military historian. I don't.
Right.
I can't.
Village, Arlington Village. There are many of them.
Yeah.
They're historic status.
They were when they opened, they were segregated, and they had different counterparts. Let me see if I have that quickly at my disposal. If I can rattle off some of the names for you. Because, let me see what I got.
My understanding is that in what little research I've done is that particularly Colonial Village, and I don't know as much about Fairlington, although I suspect it may be the same, is through the FHA insurance program, because FHA was redlining and favored restrictive covenants at that time. That was sort of the part of the application process, is that you would agree that you would restrict the to a homogeneous population, and that is how it ended up becoming, in part a whites only building or complex.
But the point is, part of their history is a segregated history. And I've lived in Colonial Village and Arlington Village, and I have never seen anything written in their publications that acknowledge their segregationist birthing.
Mhm. Yeah, so yes, that would be accurate. And yeah, I was trying to remember when I was talking about one of the ones that were more barracks style. There were Jeb Stuart homes were built, and those were for Arlington's. Those were exclusively white. So let me see. So some of the white developments that were built at that time were called George Pickett, Shirley, Jeb Stuart, Jubal Early homes were all emergency housing for war workers. And these white developments were named after Confederate officers. And I'm trying to see if I can find the names quickly of the African-American counterparts, but literally trying to scroll through my dissertation. But yes, yeah. The homes that had been right there in not Green Valley on the 395 ramp, if people know the ones that I'm
Paul
talking
Dunbar
about.
was
Yeah,
one.
the Dunbar homes were originally affordable housing complexes created during World War II, following the construction of Queen City. So that was an example of one of the housing developments that was created specifically for African Americans in that like the Jeb Stuart houses, which looked almost the same, the barracks kind of style, were created for white residents.
Any additional?
Hi,
Okay.
Lindsay, thanks. Can you say, I guess you were talking, we know, like, I guess that Arlington and our neighbors, Alexandria and Falls Church, are primarily the majority, I guess, progressive counties compared to, say, Fairfax and further out like Loudoun and such. But knowing that, I guess the covenants and such that you said were struck down, I guess, in like the 48 and then, but it wasn't until like the 68, 69 that got rid of. Any idea when Arlington kind of flipped to majority progressive? What decade that would be about, like 70s or by the 80s, I would say?
Yeah, so it's always a moving target about what would be constituted, but a very major change in Arlington's social and political makeup happened in the 1940s and 1950s when tons of new federal transplants were coming here. The overall education level of Arlington citizens went way up. Many of these people were arriving from beyond the South, which changed social makeups. You had a rise in investment. A lack of investment was very much a cornerstone of the kind of Southern progressivism that Mackey and the League spearheaded, which didn't support as much centralized government-led projects, partly because they had enough money to pay for them within their own communities. So it led to like a much bigger rise in investment and a much more progressive social and political makeup.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I got to go back and look at the election results and see about where, where we turned blue compared to like a lot of the other ones are still red here and there.
Yeah, and my research stopped hard about 76. So I have read things obviously about the 80s, 90s, and today, but that's not my cup of tea.
So Lindsay, somebody asked if your dissertation is available online.
It is. Lucky for all of you, I have a very unique name. So if you
I will type it.
Google me,
Email it to
then
me.
it will come out. But I can also, yeah, I can send it to the group
Well, if you have
hosts. And
a link, I could potentially type it in the chat room.
You want me to find a link now? Okay.
No, that's all right. If you want to send it, I can send it out to people. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, sure, I'll Google my name.
Are there
Thank
any
you very
additional
much.
questions? And we have time for one more question. Okay, well, Lindsay, thank you so much for this really informative. It's a
Yeah.
grew up in the county, so this was a very interesting to me. And I know that from the questions, I know that people found some great connections.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your evening. We thank all of you for attending and hope to see you on future AHS events.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. You got me out of bedtime routine for the night, so happy to be here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Bye.
Goodbye, all.